Amy, I think you're muted.
Yeah, you're muted, Amy.
Well, that's not helpful. Sorry, everyone. Today we are so excited. Our academy is sponsored by Better Impact today, so they are one of our sponsors, and so we want to thank them for their support. On our agenda today, we'll do some housekeeping. We've got a couple of announcements. We'll introduce our presenter and then get into our main presentation. We will save question and discussion time as well at the end. So you are all on mute right now. We are going to ask you to use the chat or question and answer section for comments or questions. This session is recorded and we will place the slide deck recording and handouts on the live member side in just a few days. So be watching out for that in the future. A couple of our announcements. Our next Live Academy is happening on Thursday, June 6th. That'll be at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. We'll be talking about the benefits of utilizing volunteers with disabilities. We do have an Alive members newsletter, which will be coming out next Saturday. And then if you are going to the Points of Light conference in Houston, we hope you will join us on June 10th for a networking social. So today's presentation is separate from the Alive survey that was conducted last year, but we are working on tabulating those results and hope to have something to share with you soon. So you can get more information at our website. We will be presenting those results at the Point of Light conference in June. So again, if you're planning on joining us for that, we look forward to sharing that information with you. If you will also save the date, we have the Volunteer Managers Hybrid Conference date set, so October 22nd and 23rd this year. The topic is creating influence in your organization, thinking beyond your seat at the table. So announcements on what our speakers will be coming up soon. This is again a partnership with Better Impact, and we are excited to get into this topic this year. So without further delay, I want to go ahead and introduce our presenters today. So we are joined by Dr. Allison Russell and Kayla Parker from the University of Texas at Dallas. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen so you can share yours. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having us. Let me get my screen going real quick. There we go. Okay.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Kayla. Thanks everyone for being here. It's really an honor to be here talking with all of you today. Many of you on this call may have already met us or spoken with us or interacted with us in some capacity. And we're just thrilled to be here today to talk with you a bit about a research study that we've been working on together over the course of the past, I would say it's been about a year since we kind of started working on it. And so we're going to share with you kind of the evolution of that project and some of the preliminary findings. As Amy mentioned, this is separate from the survey that Alive is doing. However, we are excited to find ways to kind of put our work in conversation with the work that Alive is doing, as well as the work that other organizations have been doing around the profession and kind of the development of the profession and advocacy in that space. So we welcome all of your comments, questions, and feedback, and we'll be keeping an eye on the chat as we go, and we'll also have time at the end for questions. But to introduce myself, I'm Allison Russell. I am currently an assistant professor at UT Dallas. I was a doctoral student and postdoc at the University of Pennsylvania prior to this, where I had the great fortune to work with some amazing scholars as well as some wonderful volunteer administrators in the field to kind of develop research around volunteerism and volunteer administration. And so as I've transitioned into my role at UT Dallas, I've kind of tried to continue this work. I've had the great fortune to work with Kayla Parker, who's here with us. She is a doctoral student in our program and also has worked as a volunteer administrator herself. So getting to work with her kind of, has been awesome and has helped to kind of move some of our research forward as well. And Kayla, I'll let you say, I don't know if you want to introduce yourself, have anything to add.
Yeah, hi, I'm Kayla Parker. I'm a second year PhD student, so I'm about halfway through my program. My focus is on volunteer administration, volunteering, and volunteer management, among other things, of course, because I'm an inherently curious person, but I really love that area of research. I was a volunteer manager, got thrown into it during COVID, and I fell in love with the profession. So studying it felt very natural to me. I'm also a former volunteer. I'm an AmeriCorps Vista alum, spent 3 years doing that as well. So this is just a slight obsession as a topic for me as well. I'm very, very blessed to be able to work with Dr. Russell on this project and in a lot of other projects as well.
Cool. So we want to share a little bit about the origins of this particular study and project. So we're calling it Career Pathways of Volunteer Administrators. We want to just shout out that volunteer administrator is not the only title we could use to call this study, but we have chosen it because it is one of the most widely used in the literature, and we all kind of understand, what that means. So we can kind of debate later if we maybe need to change that. But this study is really kind of born out of, as I mentioned, conversations I've had through the years with volunteer administrators in the field. And, really trying to think about how the profession has evolved, how people end up in this profession, and, thinking about these journeys that you all take to end up where you are. And, in the literature, we really don't have anything, academic literature that looks at this particular to volunteer administrators. But we know that this is a growing, field and a growing profession. You all on this call have probably seen it grow and change through the years. And so what we really wanted to do was, basically look more deeply at how people end up in this profession, what kind of, journeys they take to get here, as a way to better understand the current practice of the profession, as well as where the profession is going in the future. And so we, and recognizing that, we wanted to really partner with and, engage with volunteer administrators through this research, which is why we chose the approach that we did, which Kayla will talk about in a couple minutes. And so additionally, of course, this study is also grounded in the fact that volunteerism is ubiquitous in our society, that there's many benefits to communities and individuals for engaging in volunteering. And volunteer administrators are the people who make that possible, right? And so, especially in this moment of change and transition with post-COVID and figuring out where this is all going, in the future, we figured the right time to really be diving into these questions and trying to better understand, the experiences of volunteer administrators as a way to speak to, policy and practice, as well as on the academic side, theory and all that stuff. So I'll turn it over to Kayla to share more about the study itself.
So we approached this study with 3 basic research questions. They are, how do volunteer administrators perceive their career path? What is the kind of the story they tell around that? How do they explain their motivation for working with as volunteer administrators? So what motivated them to get into their careers? And then what was sort of the preparation and training that they had for this role? So these are pretty broad questions. Because it was a qualitative study, we were able to have these broad research questions so that we were allowing a lot of different findings to come to us that have nuance and subtleties, and allow us to really explore in depth this topic. Before we even really sort of delved into the collection of data, or even sort of like the creation of our our interview questions, we looked back at what sort of research had been done in the past on this topic. And again, as Dr. Russell said, there hasn't been a ton specifically on career pathways of volunteer administrators, but I wanted to highlight a few because I found them really interesting. And I think as volunteer administrators yourself, you'd find them interesting as well. There was a very, very large study done by Brudney and Schmall in partnership with the Association of Volunteer Administrators, which of course does not exist anymore, unfortunately. But it was a two-part survey. One survey was done in 92 and the other one was done in 2000. So not incredibly recent, but recent enough to be relevant. And it was a broad survey of volunteer administrators. And some of the findings that they found were that from 92 to 2000, the profession was becoming slightly more gender diversified. So when I say slightly, I mean in 1992, their survey found that it was 92.1% female, and then that moved down to 89.8% female in 2000. It was becoming slightly more racially diverse, kind of along those same number lines. The participants of the survey were becoming more educated, so more bachelor's degrees and more higher education was being obtained. Far more, actually. I think they doubled in percentage. But there was only slightly more training in volunteer administration. So the survey participants talked about how while they were becoming more educated in terms of college, they were not finding more volunteer administration professional development opportunities. So again, this was a really great foundational study for us to jump off of for our study, but it's a little bit older and it doesn't technically look at the career paths of volunteer administrators. Another study that was sort of tangential to our study that we liked was a study on fundraisers for colleges and universities, so a lot of alumni relation fundraisers, and how they found themselves in the profession. And the study found that a lot of them found themselves in the profession because they fell into it almost by accident. They weren't seeking out this profession, they weren't seeking out this career, they just found themselves in this career. So that gave us maybe insight into what we might find when we talk to volunteer administrators. And then finally, we picked a theory called person organization fit and person job fit. And this theory is often applied to job seekers as well as organizations that are hiring. And it just says that people who look for jobs often look at organizations that share the same values that they have and look for jobs that have the same skill sets that they believe they have. So when we look at the career paths of volunteer administrators, we would assume they might fall along those same lines. Now, again, we were very open as to what we would find in terms of this area, but it gave us sort of like a pathway to look at. And so when we talked about the career pathways of volunteer administrators with these study participants, we were looking for any instances of whether or not their skill sets matched the job listing, or if they felt like they had the same values of the organization they were joining into in their career. So that's the past research we looked at. The study itself consisted of qualitative narrative interviews. So just long sit-down interviews. Most of them took about an hour, but it was roughly between 45 minutes to an hour. All of them conducted on Microsoft Teams. Thank you, Microsoft Teams, for your transcription software. It was very helpful. It was really nice to be able to use Microsoft Teams as well, because as I'll show in the demographics portion, we were able to talk to people from all over the United States, which is really, and Canada, which was really great. And it really kind of opened up the borders a bit for us in terms of who we were able to have in the study. We advertised on LinkedIn for the most part. Dr. Russell and I both have connections to the community, and we know how to use some good hashtags. So we were able to post on LinkedIn about the study, and also reached out to a few volunteer administration professional organizations, some of the local chapters. But honestly, we got so much traction from the LinkedIn post that I was not able to use my full list of professional organizations to reach out to, because we reached kind of our capacity for study participants pretty quickly. I don't think either one of us should have been shocked that volunteer administrators were eager to volunteer. But it was really wonderful to see. We were hoping to get about 30 interviews and we ended up with 55, which is wonderful. And gave us some really fantastic, deep findings that I cannot wait to share with you. Before we get to those though, I wanted to give you some demographics of the study participants that we interviewed. Okay. So the first is gender, and it is a little stark. So we did have vast majority of our participants identified as female. We did have a few male participants in there, but the vast majority were female participants. In terms of race and ethnicity, the vast majority identified as white or not Hispanic. And there was pretty tame amounts of diversity in terms of participant demographics, in terms of race and ethnicity. Age was a little bit more even, with the vast majority of our participants fitting within the 36 to 55 range. So that doesn't say that like all of our participants had a lot of experience within the field, but they were at that points in their career, so that age in their career in the field. So not a lot of Gen Z in our study, but quite a few millennial and boomer generation and Gen X generation in our study participant demographics. And then finally, location. So this sort of parses out in terms of population wise. We are having some states that did not have anybody represented, and some a little bit more heavily, such as Texas and Virginia. But on the most part, it was a pretty nice spread from East Coast to West Coast in terms of who decided to participate in our study. We did not seek out Canadian participants, but they snuck in, and we kept them in. They had some fantastic things to say, and we saw no reasons to exclude them. So we did have 2 Canadian participants as well. But we had 5 from Texas, 4 from Virginia, and 3 from California and New York as kind of like our heavy hitters, and everyone else was roughly 2 or 1. Yeah, so we were really proud of kind of how widespread we were able to get the study participants in terms of location. So we do all these interviews. We do these 55 interviews throughout September and October. Get to talk to 55 volunteer administrators about their experiences. And now we have all this transcribed data because, of course, Microsoft Teams transcribed it for us. So thank you very much, Microsoft Teams. We anonymize it completely. So as you'll notice when we talk about our findings, we'll quote people in the study, but we have anonymized their names. We will not mention their exact organizations they work for or their locations. So we take that pretty fairly seriously in terms of protecting participant privacy. Once we have anonymized and transcribed these interviews, which is done, we start doing the deep readings of the transcripts for patterns and themes. So we read through each transcript and tag and highlight areas that we keep seeing pop up, or themes that we keep seeing pop up throughout the different transcriptions, different interviews. And sometimes they fit within the ideas that other people have talked about, and sometimes there's outliers. The outliers are just as important, and we want to notate them as well. But then we start forming kind of these categories of themes of what was really discussed, what sort of deeper meanings were happening within these interviews, and what can that tell us more about the subject that we're talking about. It was highly collaborative. It has continued to be highly collaborative. Dr. Russell and I both work with the transcripts, we work with the interviews. We conducted interviews, both of us. This is a true partnership of a study. And so we're often talking back and forth about the different themes that we're finding and tailoring them and tweaking them and making sure that the information that we were getting, this good, wonderful interview information that we got from study participants, is being interpreted correctly, as well as being put in the correct themes and categories. And it's currently ongoing. We did have 55 interviews. So we are currently still working through all of them, but we've got some really solid findings. We hope to sort of finish up the analysis portion of this project over the summer. But we've been having a really fun time with it. So yeah, that's sort of the data analysis portion. All right, so here's the juicy stuff. So this is what we've learned so far with this study. So these are the findings that we've had so far. Again, they are still being formed as we do more analysis of the data that we've collected. But these are some of the really interesting findings. They're the ones that, that we think are most solid right now, and we wanted to share them with you. Okay, so here are 4 major themes. So the first one is volunteer modeling. Then we have career visibility, professional development, and then career respect and legitimacy. And I'm going to go through each of these major themes, talk about them, sort of how they presented within the data that we collected, and then give examples of some of the quotes that we're using to support creation of these themes. Again, if you guys have any comments or questions while we go through these, feel free to pop them in the chat or raise your hand. I am more than happy to stop and talk, but also we would love to have a discussion about these themes at the end of this presentation. So, volunteer modeling. So when we asked questions about, we had a question in our interview schedule that asked about whether or not the volunteer administrator had volunteered when they were young. Like, how did they get into this whole idea? I think we wanted to sort of understand from the beginning if there was anything to the idea that volunteering led to this career, or if it had any influence. And the vast majority of them said they had volunteered as youth. Some as young as 5, some in high school through more formalized volunteering. A lot of them mentioned that their parents and guardians were involved in the community or volunteered and modeled that sort of volunteering to them. Their parents or guardians were the ones who sort of got them into volunteering. They often volunteered within schools or religious organizations. School volunteering often led to college volunteering if they went into higher ed. And then they often, and this is again, not all across the board, but like the good majority of our participants grew up sort of seeing involvement in the community and volunteering as a bit of a cultural norm. It was just something you did, whether or not that was modeled by their parents or not. It was just part of being a part of a community, was volunteering. So here are some of the quotes from our participants on this subject. I got to choose the names, so be kind. The anonymized names. So for Regina, she volunteered when she was in high school because her mom kind of pushed her to, or their mom kind of pushed them to. Before that, it was just random things with her mom or grandmother. And moms and grandmothers do come up quite a bit, so that makes sense. Another participant talked about how it was just part of being the family. It was growing up with the family. Again, mostly I think it was my mom. She kind of drove us to volunteer related activities. And then I like Jade's. They said, my parents made me. They said, you will volunteer. Yes, ma'am. Yes, sir. My parents were both educators, and they valued community work. So it was very much understood that in that household, you were going to volunteer. You weren't going to argue with it. That was just going to happen. We had other people say that they maybe didn't necessarily volunteer themselves, like Opal said, but they remember seeing their parents volunteering. So it was an example that they set for them, even if they didn't volunteer themselves as a kid. Some of them said they didn't even realize they had been volunteering for that long, but they realized it later, like, oh, I had been volunteering since I was really young. I would go to my grandma's apartment complex, and she would say, hey, I need you to, go to Miss Jean's house and Miss Sally's house and take out their trash and see if they need anything. So coming back around when they're adult and realizing that is also volunteering, and seeing that in that way was a realization for Maxine. And then Cameron said, I remember going to do Meals on Wheels again with my mom when I was little, or she was also in charge of the church after church donuts. Pardon, I should have edited that a little better. And the after church donuts, which I grew up in a church, and I do remember after church donuts. So it's a very important volunteer opportunity there. So what are the implications of this theme? So when Dr. Russell and I talked kind of about, well, what does it mean? How can this be helpful? What can we glean from this sort of theme and pattern that's coming out of this data? We thought about how maybe promoting volunteerism, because these participants had volunteered as youth and found themselves in this career path, that promoting volunteerism can both grow a base of volunteers for volunteer administrators later. So starting kids young, having parents promote it to their children could be a useful tool for volunteer administrators in terms of having more volunteers to work with, which I know is something that post-COVID has talked a lot about, the lack or the lower number of volunteers available. But it's also maybe potentially a way to grow a base for the profession. So promoting this sort of idea of volunteering in the community as youth could lead to more people being interested in becoming volunteer administrators if it's leveraged in that way. But we also saw this as we need to keep in the back of our mind as we look back at our demographics of our study, that we need to make sure that we're mindful of who has access to these volunteer opportunities, who are we promoting volunteerism with, is it inclusive, and who are we including in the volunteer spaces, so that we can create a diverse field of professionals, that we can create a diverse field of volunteers in the future. So yeah, very interesting volunteer modeling. Okay. The next theme was career visibility. And this actually fell in line with some of the literature. If you remember, I talked about the college fundraisers who found themselves just fell into the profession of being a fundraiser. We saw some of that as well in the interviews. In fact, quite a few people that they sort of accidentally became volunteer administrators, or it got added on as an extra hat to the jobs they already had, especially at times because of COVID, because they needed someone else to take on this role. Before becoming a volunteer administrator, they didn't realize that it was a career option. There wasn't a lot of visibility within career days or within there are maybe college courses that talk about this as a job. And honestly, a lot of them said they didn't even know what volunteer administrators did on the day-to-day basis. They didn't know what this career entailed, what the job skills were that were needed, what the job descriptions had in mind when you become a volunteer administrator. So some of these examples, Casey said, I had no idea at the time there was a niche just to work with volunteers. I had no clue. They were looking for a job, but they didn't want to do fundraising. So their friends said, there's jobs in nonprofits that don't require fundraising. They're like, I don't know what you're talking about. I have no clue. Tell me more. And that's how they found their way into volunteer administration. Harley often had to, well, not often, but Harley said that they had to explain to people when they tell them that they are a volunteer administrator that no, they actually get paid to do this, that they are not a volunteer, they are a paid employee. So there's that sort of misunderstanding due to lack of visibility of the career or lack of knowledge about the career for people outside of maybe nonprofits or outside of the profession as to what does it mean to work with volunteers. So having to explain that to people. Greg talked about how they became a volunteer administrator because it just got lumped in with their existing job title due to COVID. We were made a volunteer administrator due to the convenience of them being one. Their organization needed one. They were there. They were made a volunteer administrator. And Taylor sort of echoed that they fell accidentally into it. It wasn't intentional, and with none of their backgrounds sort of matched it. However, we did have an outlier with Twyla, who said that I know everyone just falls into it and they never thought they would do it. So they recognize that is pretty like a common trope amongst people who talk about it with them. But for them, it was a very, very clear path to becoming a volunteer administrator. So we did have a bit of an outlier there. Mm-hmm. So what are the implications of this for career visibility? We think that maybe the lack of visibility of this as a profession is keeping people from entering it as a career field. They don't know it exists. It's hard to seek out job opportunities for it, intentionally or not intentionally. It might perpetuate the entrance of people who lack training in the field. If you do not know that this is a career that you want to go into, if you do not know that this is a profession that's out there for you, you're not going to seek out pre-training. You're not going to seek out training before you get into it. You'll get into it because you fell into it, and then now you are training on the job, or you're seeking out those professional development opportunities in real time. And then we saw this as another indication of how vital it is to promote this as a profession, to promote this as a field that you can work in, and creating tactics to do that in a bigger way, so that when people do see this, understand that this is a career, they will be able to seek it out as opposed to accidentally become a volunteer administrator. The third theme is professional development. And under professional development, we have quite a few different kind of areas to explore there. So it's a quite large theme, but it is a large portion of what we asked the study participants about. We wanted to know what sort of training and development they had, either coming into the field or during their time as a volunteer administrator. And some of the different things that popped up multiple times for us are that there is this desire for a more standardized or united front in professional development, that the resources that exist, and there are a lot of resources that exist, are pretty scattered. You have to really be self-motivated to go find them. You have to seek them out from very good Google searches, from other volunteer administrators in the profession that you know, which brings me to sort of the community of knowledge sharing. There's this great conversation in a lot of these interviews about how they found out about professional development from other volunteer administrators. And they also used other volunteer administrators as resources for their own professional development. So through things like community groups, these professional development, professional organizations like Alive, like the state or local level professional organizations for volunteer administrators, all the way down to just casual groups of volunteer administrators that would come together and talk, or, and this is not my words, this is the words of participants, quote unquote, vent, that even those groups that get together are incredibly important to their learning how to do this profession better, by sharing issues and problems that each of the volunteer administrators had. They were able to learn and grow as a volunteer administrator themselves. So there's this like vast network of community knowledge sharing that's happening amongst volunteer administrators, both within the profession as a whole and then also within subsectors. So if you think of like art museum, volunteer administrators might get together and talk about issues and challenges that come with working within that subsector as well. One I think was mentioned was a group of librarians that started getting, our library volunteer administrators that would get together weekly to chat just casually via Zoom during the COVID pandemic. And it was something that just was not formalized, and it just kept going, which I found really interesting. We also asked them about what sort of skills they thought were most necessary to succeed in this profession. And a lot of soft skills were mentioned. So empathy, communication, and customer service. And in fact, when we talk about professional development, because a lot of people didn't come in with professional development in volunteer administration before they became volunteer administrators, many of them cited customer service experience as a way that they were able to grow the skills that they needed to be a volunteer administrator on the job. They cited working as a barista or a bartender or in retail as a way for them to have grown these skills to be good at volunteer administration. So some of these quotes. Harley said, but what I did, Harley was at an organization that the organization didn't really know what they were supposed to do. They didn't know what they were doing when they got there, and the organization didn't know what they were supposed to be doing when they got there. And so they contacted a local volunteer center and did end up eventually getting their CVA. So again, it's the self-motivated, I have to seek out this professional development opportunities because they're not ingrained sort of in the organization or well-known amongst the organization and management, that sort of issue. Brent talked about how the professional development is not standardized. It's kind of all over the place. There's no one agreed upon theory for volunteer administration. And he saw that as an area of growth for this field. Krista talked about there's a lot of training opportunities, but they're mainly tailored towards people who are just starting as volunteer administrators. So maybe there's this desire for more advanced trainings for those who have been in the field for a long time. Rainer talked about how the sort of the scattered effect and the lack of standardization, because every organization they felt created sort of their own training, so that there's a lot out there, but a lot it's not very cohesive. And they saw that maybe collaboration could bring together a best practices in one place. Noelle talked about skills, people skills being the #1 skill that they use day to day, or is most important to volunteer administrators. Those interpersonal skills, the working with people and being able to work with people and build relationships. And Zamira echoed this with empathy. You need to be compassionate, but understand that the people that you work with are people, and meet them where they are. So again, a pretty broad theme. So a lot of implications for such a broad theme. So professional development implications. There is this call for standardization of professional development knowledge from a few, at least, I mean, from some of our study participants. So that is something that could be taken into account when looking towards the future of what professional development means for volunteer administrators. If there is a way to sort of standardize, I know that the CVA is sort of being seen as more of a place for that standardization to happen. But if there is this desire for that, what can we do as a career or as a profession to sort of accelerate that or meet that need? Desire for more advanced professional development opportunities, that was mentioned multiple times, in terms of getting a lot of the same sort of basic trainings offered by a wide variety of different professional organizations or certificate programs. But some more advanced professional development opportunities would be nice. One of the issues might be that those who don't look for resources, those people who are, or volunteer administrators who aren't self-motivated, might be left behind, because that is how people are finding professional development opportunities, or that is how our study participants have said that they found professional development opportunities. Not always. Sometimes the organizations did direct them towards resources, but a large portion of our study participants did have to look outside their organization for those. So if they're not looking for the resources, then they will have a tougher time advancing professionally or becoming more successful as a volunteer administrator. And we think that there's an opportunity to leverage this high level of interest in professional development and community of knowledge sharing. There is a lot of energy around professional development, it sounds like, in volunteer administration. And I think that can be leveraged to create the sort of opportunities that that volunteer administrators want to see in the future in terms of professional development. There isn't a lack of desire or a lack of knowledge or a lack of eagerness to share that knowledge. It's just how does this profession want to see that? What form does it want to take in the future that would best serve the profession as a whole? And then the last major theme, before we get into visions of the future, the last major theme is career respect and legitimacy. So throughout the interviews, but especially towards the end of the interviews, we kind of talked about what is your greatest wish? If you could have anything as a volunteer administrator that would make your life easier in your profession, what would it be? What are your hopes for the future? And so these topics sort of brought up some career respect and legitimacy themes when it comes to volunteer administration. A lot of our participants talked about not having a seat at the table. So a lot of them talked about not being part of those strategic management meetings, not being connected with their senior leadership in those strategic meetings as well. A lack of resources was often brought up, either through budgets, a lack of staff, so time was always a resource that was limited, a lack, again, yeah, not even receiving a budget at their organization, a lack of support for professional development. After we talked about professional development in the interviews, we'd always ask, did you cover the costs of professional development opportunities, or did your organization? And some people did have their organization cover it and fully support professional development, but a lot of them covered it out of pocket, especially the CVA, because there just was a lack of understanding by management and by senior leadership as to what that professional development was needed for, because it was tied to this idea of a lack of understanding by the work done by volunteer administrators as a whole. So many of our study participants felt that not only were they not being invited to the management table, but that the management table didn't really know what they did or how their program fit within the organization as a whole. So some of the quotes that fall within those lines are, as Amy talked about at the very beginning, the Federal Department of Labor doesn't recognize us as a field, as mentioned by Taylor. This is something that both academics and volunteer administrators would both like to see happen, because when the Department of Labor recognizes your profession as a field, they start collecting data on it, and we would love to have that data. But yeah, so it felt that the career isn't even recognized by the US government. And not just in the US, but Taylor mentioned very few countries across the globe recognize this as an independent field. Susan talked about how I didn't feel that people were taking me seriously as a volunteer administrator, both within and outside of the organization. So having more respect around the profession as a whole was something that she talked about. Bernadette, I really like this quote. I finally snapped a little bit, honestly, and said, "You all are having management meetings. I am now a manager. You never include me in these meetings. I'm busting down the door and coming in." So this is when they were at working at a Humane Society and at their previous positions, and have decided they had enough with not having a seat at the table, and really having to advocate for themselves to be a part of those strategic meetings for the nonprofit as a whole. Tori talked about wanting a bigger budget. If they could wish for one thing, it would be a bigger budget. Of course, for volunteers, but for just generally more resources to invest in their programs. Annabelle talked about how their CEO and senior leadership doesn't really just see the volunteer program, doesn't see stories about volunteer engagement. And when they do, they're like, oh, hey, maybe this is something like we could think about, or we're doing any of this yet. How would this impact the organization? But it's something Annabelle had been doing, and Annabelle had already been thinking about it. Just they hadn't really noticed or seen the volunteer program there. And then Brandy talked about how it wasn't considered important for the volunteer department to have professional development, upward mobility, or generally supported in any fashion at their organization. And that was different from other departments in their organization. So they felt they were kind of left out of that sort of respect and legitimacy at their organization. Yeah. So this one has clearly like a lot of impacts potentially on the profession, and some of them that we talked about, and we'd love to hear from you about these as well. But this could impact salaries if the profession isn't respected or seen as legitimate. Could lead to lower salaries compared to even other jobs within management in nonprofits. Again, a lack of input of strategic planning, which can harm organizations as a whole, because volunteer management deals with a lot of really big resources. Volunteers are a resource to the organization, and if they're not included in that strategic planning, it could stunt an organization. Lack of professional advancement and career advancement opportunities within the organization. We often heard about how there was no upward mobility, that you reach a certain point as a volunteer manager or volunteer administrator, and there's just nowhere to go from there. There wasn't a senior leadership position in volunteer administration. And stunted programs due to lack of resources. So because you don't get a budget, because you have a lower budget or lack the resources that you need to conduct your program in the way that you want to conduct it, you'll never reach the full potential of the volunteer program within your organization. So those, I just talked for a very long time. Those are the 4 major themes that we found emerging from the data we've collected in this study. We are so grateful to the volunteer administrators who shared their time with us. An hour is a lot of time for a volunteer administrator to volunteer for us for this study, but they gave us a lot of really fantastic insights. The next section I'm really excited that Dr. Russell is going to talk about is actually kind of the next step in the study, which is the visions of the future that these volunteer administrators had. So.
Yes, thanks, Kayla. So I am so interested in the chat right now, but I will speak to what I plan to say as well. But please keep putting your comments in because I've been reading them as Kayla's been talking. So we wanted to kind of wrap our presentation up by talking about what you all, those who participated, and just generally people had shared about their visions for the future of the profession. So if you can go to the next slide, Kayla. So we asked people what they saw as their ideal vision for the profession for the next 5 to 10 years. And so people gave us a lot of different responses, and they kind of touched on 8 main topics. So the first was professional training and education, which Kayla already talked a lot about, but people seeing an ideal vision where there are more opportunities for professional training, where it's more accessible, as well as more opportunities for formal education. So a lot of people actually said they wish there was more university programs geared directly towards volunteer administration, specifically mentioning not just one course, but ideally like a minor or even, in a grad program, like a concentration, or, possibly embedded within an HR program, some kind of way to specialize in this and take more than just one class on the subject. Next, you can go to the next point. Sorry, I made these animated. So the next one was professional visibility, respect, and legitimacy, which again, Kayla had already spoken about, but kind of from a broader societal level, right? People speaking to this desire to see that, others actually recognized and acknowledged what their profession was. Like if it comes up in conversation, as it so often does, people would actually understand what that meant. Oh, you are a volunteer engagement leader, or you're a volunteer administrator. Oh yeah, I've heard of that. That's cool. And that there was some kind of more recognition and respect for that profession, as opposed to the typical response, which is either just crickets or maybe like, oh, you're a volunteer. As Kayla had already shared some quotes where that was sort of the reaction people got. Next, go to the next point. So the other, another thing was prioritization and recognition of the importance of the role, and as well as volunteering and volunteer management as strategy. So this is more so internal to the organization, right? And really like at the leadership level, especially, but this sort of understanding that, volunteers aren't just kind of like these nice to have kind of window dressing, oh yeah, like we have some volunteers, isn't it great, right? But that leadership was really looking at this as a strategic part of the organization, and that in the future, ideally, there would be those seats at the table in the leadership meetings and in management meetings and in strategic planning for the organization as a whole. And so, not just that society sees this as a profession, right? But that, within the own organization, leadership is actually prioritizing it as something of strategic value. And, I think to someone's comment who I was trying to respond to before I started talking, but didn't get to, but, I don't think that it's necessarily that the attitudes are, always just like dismissive or negative, right? And we've heard this in our interviews, but leadership is often expresses gratitude and is positive, but it's like the disconnect of then backing that up with material resources, right? And backing that up with the support that's needed, and also like acknowledging that if your title is manager, then you should be at a management meeting. So there's like good intentions in some cases, but there's not follow through in a way that actually leads to real change within that organization. You can go to the next point. So succession planning came up, and we've been chatting about this in the chat, that if there's low compensation, there's high turnover. There's often the position is the only position that's dealing directly with volunteers in the organization. And so you're like a department of one, which means that, resources are kind of tied to that person, or knowledge is tied to that person. So if that person leaves, no matter how much they've built or how much they've grown in their position within that organization, if they leave, they take those things with them. They may not get left behind in this meaningful way as you might hope. There's no one there to kind of ensure that transition happens smoothly. And also, there is a tendency of organizations perhaps to then perpetually downgrade this position to an entry-level job, and not recognizing that, they're not going to bring someone in who is equivalent to the person that just transitioned out. You can go to the next point. So collaboration, partnership, and networking were big. This was speaking to, ideally seeing more kind of collaboration across organizations, but also within the field itself, within the profession itself, more opportunities for networking and for engagement with each other, in order to, again, share knowledge, share resources, and really build up the professional community. So folks hope to see more of that in the next 5 to 10 years. Next point. Obviously, compensation and resources. People were hoping for more fair, more adequate compensation. Some people we spoke with were even not sure they would be in the profession in 5 or 10 years as a result of there being no more real upward mobility, either within their organization or just kind of in general, right? And so oftentimes people might get to sort of the pinnacle of this space pretty quickly, and they either transition to a different role in that organization, or they might transition to a different organization and also a different role. So, if there's no opportunities to continue to grow, then, you're not going to see people sticking around. And of course, we expect to see that, in any kind of nonprofit or public sector job over time, right? Oftentimes people do they may make lateral moves, or they may make upward moves, within the agency to a slightly different department or something like that. And, that's common, but it's a problem if what we're trying to do is, again, increase the visibility and the legitimacy of the profession, and really get, people that seat at the table at the management level. Diversity, inclusivity, and representation was a theme that came up, that people hope to see more of this, both within the profession and within volunteering as a whole. So our participants, were highly aware of this as a challenge, or as something that they were aspiring to, right? Even, from whatever their own personal identities were, a lot of people relayed this as something they hope to see more of, and that they valued, and that they spoke to the sort of need to better represent their volunteers, as well as better represent their communities through, growing the diversity of the profession, and ensuring that, people from all different, identities and walks of life are even aware that this is an opportunity for them, and opening that up to as many people as possible. And then finally, there was a lot of discussion around the future of volunteering itself, and what that will look like in 5 to 10 years. Of course, as in the wake of COVID and coming back from COVID, it's like, what does volunteering look like? A lot of people mentioned that they felt that there was going to be less and less kind of regular or long-term kind of volunteering, and there's more, sort of episodic or short-term volunteering. And so understanding like what volunteering will look like as well going forward is going to, in their mind, shape how the profession looks in that time. And so being mindful that those two things are intertwined, and that, volunteer administrators do have power in shaping, what volunteerism looks like, and kind of vice versa. And so talking about what that might look like was a big part of this category of answers. So just to share a few quotes with you all, and, these just all speak to all these different 8 themes. But, for the first respondent, Fiona, they mentioned that, they felt that there's really this scrappy grassroots desire to grow and support the field from volunteer administrators themselves, and that the missing piece is actually the organizations, right? And this recognition that, you know, volunteer engagement is equal to other programs within the organization, in being a proactive approach and a strategy that organizations should use to better, you know, better create impact, and better achieve their mission, whatever that mission might be. And then Sterling mentioned, again, more respect and more visibility for the profession, elevating the professional nature of the role, that we are professionals, that we have a specific skill set that makes us good at our job. And of course, we're all replaceable, but, you know, we are equally talented, or we are uniquely talented for our job, right? So again, this desire to sort of see that people acknowledge that people are doing this job because they do have a unique skill set and something they're bringing to the table, and while people may have fallen into things originally, what they do to develop this skill set, both, you know, on the job and through trainings and through formal education, and sometimes on their own expense, right, is it makes them kind of uniquely positioned, and really acknowledging that and seeing that as valuable, is something they hope to see more of in the next 5 to 10 years. You can go to the next slide. So again, speaking to the diversity theme, people hope to see there would be more diverse, you know, people in the volunteer opportunities themselves. So among volunteers, as well as among volunteer administrators and staff in general. And that, you know, if we want to create change in the world, especially in these nonprofits and mission-driven organizations, right, you have to broaden the way you think and how you get things done. And one way to do that is to diversify who is actually doing that work. Again, speaking to the desire for more formal education. So having some sort of coursework, you know, having areas where volunteer administrators can be defined as a profession. And Michelle in the chat had said something about this, but, you know, and we see this in the academic literature on professionalization broadly, that, you know, the education piece is part of this sort of formal process of professionalizing. And so for better or worse, education and formal educational opportunities is a way for professions to gain visibility, traction, identity, and legitimacy, right? That does bring up those questions and challenges around the idea of being more inclusive, because if you, as you professionalize, you also run the risk of, you know, then kind of putting up even more barriers for some people who can't maybe access certain formal education, right? So there is this balance, right, between those two things. But I think it's cool because in our interviews, we see people talking about both sides of this, right? Like you all as a profession are having these conversations, and are aware of some of these kind of inherent tensions. And I think that's really cool to see that, and see how people are committed to creating spaces that are collaborative, where people are supported and kind of people can be like uplifted as a community, and as well as opening doors for new people to come in. And then again, speaking on those issues with succession planning and compensation and career growth, right? The idea that if you leave your position, it's going to be downgraded back to an entry-level job, no matter where you kind of left it, and what that means for that, you know, future of the profession. But hoping that going forward, there's going to be more, you know, more facilitation of ensuring that, you know, succession planning happens at the same level for that organization. And obviously this is really out of the hands of volunteer administrators who are leaving a position. But if we can work towards increased visibility, right, and legitimacy and seats at the table, then we can be in the room and making these points more loudly for those in leadership who will be there when, you know, when people may themselves exit out, either retiring or, you know, transitioning to another job. And I also did want to just say, you know, with regard to the formal education piece, because I am a university professor and I teach a class called volunteer management at UT Dallas. I found it interesting to read some of these comments, and that, you know, people were saying like, we want to see more formal educational opportunities. And also people who actually were talking about, you know, who is considered expert in this space and who will be teaching these courses, right? And I think this is a really important point. The reason I'm mentioning it is because this is like a large part of my personal motivation for doing this kind of research and engaging with the profession and with you all, because whether you are in the study or not in the study, you know, this is an opportunity for me to learn from you and for us to collaborate. And everything that you say, both in these types of meetings and in research and in other spaces, you know, it informs how I do what I do and how I approach the way I teach my students, both in that class and in other classes, right? So I just want to shout this out because there are ways in which your knowledge, expertise, and wisdom informs what I'm actually teaching and how I'm teaching it. And the hope is that we can take these types of studies and use them to better, you know, to create better courses and you know, create more collaborative learning environments and really be able to, you know, open this field up to our students and make them aware of it, but also make the students who aren't necessarily going to be volunteer administrators, but maybe work in nonprofit or public agencies, make them more aware of it as well. So I'm always singing your praises and speaking about this in my classes. My students may get sick of it, but it's like, you know, it is important and it's something that, you know, we as educators, whatever spaces we're in, you know, should be trying to do. So you can go to the next slide. So just to share a little bit about where we're at and next steps. Obviously, we're still finishing up our data analysis, as Kayla mentioned. We are hoping to submit our research to some academic outlets, you know, and try to get journal articles published on these findings. However, I think even more importantly, you know, we are hoping to continue to share these study findings with you all and engage collaboratively with this community. So this is our first kind of stop in that respect. Kayla did present some of the preliminary findings at our NOVA in the fall, which is kind of more of an academic space, but we do have some of our academics and practitioners that go, and that's awesome, and we love to see it. But we're hoping to be able to continue sharing these findings with you, as well as to put this project in conversation with other research endeavors that Alive is doing, that the, you know, CVA is doing and promoting, and, you know, be able to then continue to also translate some of these research findings to a wider practice audience through as many different channels as possible. And so, you know, this is not going to be the study that dies on the shelf. We want it to be a living, you know, thing, and a study that will have returns for you all and for the profession, as well as for our students and for other academic researchers that do study volunteerism and volunteer engagement. So with that, we would love to open it up to questions. Thank you so much for listening. And, you know, we welcome your comments, questions, and feedback. So thanks so much.
I had a question specifically for you, Dr. Russell, from Colin. Are there any volunteer management courses you lead available to take virtually?
Yeah, so the volunteer management class I currently teach at UTD is online class. So it is fully online. At least currently. It may be shifting to a hybrid format, but it has been a virtual class for the past couple years. And so, you know, and we offer, you know, we have a MPA, full master's program. We also offer grad certificates in nonprofit management where, you know, the volunteer management class is an elective option for that certificate. And we also are working on, you know, a micro credential or like a sort of undergraduate level certificate. So it would be open to people who don't yet have a bachelor's degree in nonprofit management. So trying to find ways to make opportunities more available to people at different levels and different stages of their career, but not necessarily here to advertise for our programs, although it does exist. And there are also, I believe, don't tell my like department chair I was saying this, right? But I think there are also certainly professional organizations that do offer some trainings. And I know some people on this call have taught in some of them on volunteer management or, different topics related to this. So those do exist outside of university spaces. And I would definitely investigate your local kind of city or community and see if there are any associations doing that, or if there are some further afield that offer like a virtual option that may be, affordable or accessible depending on, what you're looking for. But yes, they exist. They're not as many as we would hope though, right?
Gretchen,
Yes.
to answer your question really quick, in the chat, I do have a list. I cannot take credit for it. It was put together by a different professor. But I will absolutely send you a link to that list of volunteer
Is
professional.
that the Roseanne? Is that Roseanne Mirabella's?
I think so, yes. Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
I'll send you a link to that. So there is a list of higher ed learning institutions that have nonprofit management programs or volunteer management programs that courses you can take.
That's great. And if we're able to do that, we'll certainly give credit to whoever did the list, but we could at least get that out there to the world and have that as a resource on our website.
Yeah, it's public. Roseanne Mirabella at Seton Hall University has been doing that and cataloging those for several years, and she makes it's available. So yeah, it's out there. People aren't aware of it perhaps. So we can definitely share links to that as well. But yeah, there are opportunities, and we hope to grow them to be even more relevant. And Karina, to your point in the chat earlier about previously having like advanced courses for volunteer engagement leaders, I would love to hear more about what that looked like and if anyone else knows. But thinking about, as we iterate forward collectively, right? Like what are the actual, like what would that actually look like? And thinking about ways to kind of put some of that together, or think about like how we can create spaces to share resources or to do kind of other, trainings and things like that. And I think these types of workshops are really great for, trying to disseminate kind of micro bits of information and knowledge, as well as to have these kind of conversations and think about like what you all actually want to see and actually need. So thanks to Alive for letting us be here to talk about these things with you.
Thank you.
I wondered if you would talk a little bit about the question that was asked in chat earlier. And Kayla, I think you had answered it about connections with local Dovia associations, UCVA already.
Sure. So that wasn't actually part of our demographic survey that we sent out to our study participants, but I will say the vast majority of our study participants who, when they talked about professional, would mention either the Dovia or the local organization that they received information from or received professional development from or were a part of. We also got, if they had a CVA, we learned they'd have a CVA. So that is information we can pull from the interviews pretty comprehensively, but it will take kind of digging through and finding that. But I think that's a great idea, is pulling which ones were mentioned and which ones were cited as sort of like places that our study participants went to seek out this knowledge.
Yeah. And those of you who know me in the local area, I've like made some forays into like infiltrating your local Dovias. So you can expect to see me there more in the future, but I'm also an Alive member. So I've tried to get myself in these spaces, and because it's great opportunities to share with all of you. But yeah, as Kayla said, we will definitely be able to go through and kind of like tabulate a little bit more about, what types of formal memberships or trainings people have had. Thanks, Gretchen. I got my renewal notice, so I am going to be renewing. Public reminder to renew if you are up for renewal. Any other questions? Yeah. It's that time of year for everything's coming up, I think, for getting renewed and stuff. But yeah, and I also I think one of the things I've been thinking about, and that I was thinking even more about in preparing these slides, especially looking at the the question of like strategic placement of volunteer programs and organizations, is how we might rethink certain common tools that are used specifically in the nonprofit space, but also in other types of organizations that, you know, are intended to help with strategic planning or with kind of, evaluation and all that, and how we rethink some of those to actually better account for and include the volunteer program. And so that it is more visible and it's kind of part of that, kind of strategic planning process. So, like for example, for like a logic model where you're trying to see like what are all the activities the organization is doing, right? Like having some way to document that volunteer program either as a separate activity or building the volunteers into the different activities at all the levels of the organization and reflecting that in your logic model, right? And thinking about that as you kind of prepare those types of documents or those types of tools for organizations. So it's something that I'm thinking about, and I would love to hear from any one of you on this call if you have ideas or things you've done or used. The conversation, my door's wide open. You can find me on LinkedIn. My email address is right here. It's super easy to remember, but I do want to hear from everybody. If you have additional comments or feedback after this session, feel free to send me an email or send Kayla and I an email or send us a LinkedIn message, whatever I'm trying to be more like Karina and be more active on LinkedIn. And Kayla mentioned the hashtags. That's a Kayla thing. I'm not good at hashtags either. So I'm doing my best over here, but yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I bet there's others in the audience that would agree. I just feel so seen by this research, and there is so much work that I think we can all do together to continue to move the profession forward. So we so appreciate your time here today, sharing your experience with us. This has been a great session, so we really appreciate that.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks.
We love sharing this information and we can't wait to use it more to further the field.
Absolutely. Lots of things we can do together. We do have our live Academy evaluation that we will send out after the session. So I'm going to go ahead and drop that link into the chat box. We encourage everybody to fill that out for us. And then, as we mentioned earlier, please join Alive. So we do have individual agency or local association memberships, and we also have the pay what you can, because we know, again, that not all of these positions get budgets and are fully supported. So there is a pay what you can membership option available as well. Visit us at volunteerlive.org. We hope to see you next month in June. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today.
Thanks so much, everyone. Thanks, Amy. Thanks, Gretchen.
Thank you all. Have a great rest of your week.